Okay. All right. It's 7 p.m. and let's start on time. So we also finish on time. I know it's late in the evening, and well, actually, I'm very excited to see a relatively large number attending this session. And well, we will be talking about a very amazing structure in our nervous system, the cerebellum. All right, so this is of particular interest for those who are right now taking IFS course, because in IFS we have explained cerebellum, its function and its pathways. But the goal for this session is to give you a more in-depth idea and knowledge about cerebellum, its anatomy, function, and the pathways. But at any rate, for other people, I see there are other people who are not in IFS class. Again, knowledge about cerebellum definitely helps your clinical interpretation, especially when it comes to neurological patients. Right. And by the way, I posted the link for your attendance. You may fill that out, so you will receive the certificate of attendance. All right. So, okay. All right. So the way I have structured this presentation is to first of all give you a brief opinion what happens if there is a damage to cerebellum. I put that on as the first slide because it always makes sense to know why we are learning things and how does it matter, why does it matter, and what happens if I see a patient with cerebellar damage in a clinic. And then if we understand that, then it gives us more motivation to understand the rest of the presentations. So what is happening that we get those damages? Um, then I explain about active and passive proprioception briefly, but a relatively big part is the anatomy of the cerebellum. And the reason is that you need to know the anatomy of cerebellum to understand when we talk about the input-output pathways. We refer to these structures quite often, and you need to be comfortable with these anatomical locations and definitions of the cerebellum. Very briefly about the circuitry of the cerebellum, what is inside, and then again, the rest of the presentation, which is, I would say, the biggest part, would be a functional organization of cerebellum, input-output pathways of the cerebellum, and finally a summary of what we did and wrapping up with a few questions. All right, so when there is a damage to the cerebellum for very different reasons, there are genetic disorders that cause cerebellar damage. Obviously, a stroke is another reason. When that happens, three different things can be observed in these patients. First of all, if you ask them to point to your finger and then to their nose, which is a very famous test, you would see that they do not follow the normal path that you expect somebody would do that. They overshoot and the path is not direct. So there are lots of abnormal movements and they finally reach the target. This is called dysmetria because they have inaccuracies in their range estimation and in the direction. Even though they see the path, still they can't follow, they can't do it the way normal people do that. The second thing you would see in these patients, if you ask them to just do a very simple task, bend their elbow and keep the shoulder stationary, you would see a healthy individual would do that. On the left, you would see this person keeps the shoulder where it is and can just move the elbow or the forearm up and down without any destabilization effect on the shoulder. But a cerebellar damage patient, if they have appendicular cerebellar damage, means cerebellar damage that affects the limbs, you would see they can't do that and they inadvertently move the shoulder as well. Why does that happen? You have studied in biomechanics, those who have IFS, they know whenever you move a limb and the external torque or the external moment arm changes, um, and other segments to keep it stationary must compensate for that. This means that you have to activate your shoulder muscles more or a little bit less, different type of muscles, so you keep your shoulder stationary and then you can um, just move one other segment here, the elbow. These patients can't do that. This means that when there is a destabilization in their neuromuscular or let's say muscular system, they do not detect it and they can't compensate for that. This is called ataxia. So ataxia is basically, well, we call it lack of coordination, but that lack of coordination is basically is because of failure to compensate the constantly changing torque. Another phenomenon that you see in these patients is that if you ask them to do an alternate movement, up and down, well, healthy individuals can do that very smoothly, and you would see it's very consistent. But these patients can't do that. It would be very abnormal, and they can't do a smooth alternative movement. This one is called dysdiadochokinesia. But what is cerebellum and why damage to the cerebellum cause these weird things, meaning that you can still generate movement, but it is not exactly what you wanted to do, uh, as if it has its own mind and does not follow your commands. That is where you have to, as that is why actually we have to study cerebellum. But before that, keep in mind that, well, if you actually test your patients and move their limbs and ask them, okay, where is your limb located? Um, they can answer your question. They can detect that almost as healthy people do. But when you move and you ask them to detect where their limb is, or when they move themselves, then they will have difficulty. So the problem arises and becomes very obvious in active movement, not in passive movement. I put this picture. This is from a very important paper published about cerebellum in Nature Communications, and that is doing again passive active experiment in monkeys. And in this experiment, actually, they were temporarily freezing a part of the cerebellum to see how error uh, comes in the system. All right. So with this in mind, that the cerebellum has a very crucial part in generation of movement and in controlling the movement. The fact that we can move is a good part of it. We owe a lot to the cerebellum. But let's look at its anatomy first of all. So cerebellum occupies most part or the biggest portion of our posterior fossa in our skull. And this is a posterior view of cerebellum in upright standing. So we are looking from like as if you're standing in the back of somebody looking at their cerebellum. This is what you would see. Um, a very obvious fissure can be seen from this view, from the dorsal view that we call it the primary fissure. And because of this fissure, then we can define two lobes, two anatomical lobes in the cerebellum. This is an anterior lobe, and then you would see a bigger part, which is called the posterior lobe. Um, I've highlighted them. And again, why do we call them anterior and posterior? Again, this is a convention that we use. We should use dorsal, caudal, ventral, etc. But when it comes to cerebellum, they have adopted the terminology anterior posterior. Well, if you look at the cerebellum of a cat, then it makes more sense to see that this lobe, the anterior lobe, is really anterior, posterior is posterior. In human, when because we are in upright standing, that might cause a little bit of confusion, but accept that this is anterior and this is posterior. And one other thing in the anatomy from the dorsal perspective is this worm-like structure here that we call the vermis. So right in the middle of the cerebellum or in the midline of the nervous system is this vermis, which is also a very, very important part of the cerebellum. All right, now, if I cut the cerebellum and look at it from a ventral perspective. So actually right now in this illustration, what you see, we have cut the cerebellum and now we look at it from front. So you're in front of like subject, we have removed everything, you're looking at their cerebellum. A very obvious thing that you would see are these peduncles or connectors. These are the communication passages or pathways from cerebellum to the rest of the nervous system. So that is how basically they are attached to the nervous system. Again, on top, you would see the vermis. You can still see this primary fissure right here. This is the same primary fissure we saw dorsally. You also see another fissure here that I highlighted on the left side of the image. You can see it also on the right side of the image. This is called posterolateral fissure. And with this posterolateral fissure, we can define actually a third lobe in the cerebellum. You see these two small bumps, one here and one here, they are actually above this posterolateral fissure. This bump is called flocculus. This one is called the nodulus, and we will see it in other views as well. And they are actually connected to each other. We have to do a little bit of cleanup in a real sample, remove a little bit of this peduncle, a little bit of the cortex, so we can see this this pedicle, but it looks something like that. So basically, there is a lobe right there that we call it the flocculonodular lobe. We will see it in other images as well. And want to bring to your attention that here is the fourth ventricle. So that's why we say cerebellum is actually the roof of the fourth ventricle. All right. Now this is a mid-sagittal cut of the cerebellum, and you will see this elegant tree-like structure. No wonder we call it tree of life or arbor vitae. And again, you would see the fourth ventricle right there. And you can appreciate that cerebellum is dorsal or posterior to the pons and is kind of the roof of this fourth ventricle. Again, you would see the primary fissure right here. You would see the anterior lobe. You would see the posterior lobe. And you also still see that nodulus that I showed you. The nodulus is right here. This is the nodulus. And we said this is a separate lobe connected to a flocculus. That of course we don't see flocculus in a mid-sagittal cut. So again, primary fissure, anterior lobe, and posterior lobe of the cerebellum can be seen here. All right, I want you to develop your imagination. If we make a horizontal or an axial cut, we expect to see this nodulus kind of hanging in the fourth ventricle. And you will see that actually. All right, that's it. So this is an axial cut. Actually, I start from this view. This is an axial cut of the cerebellum. And this is the fourth ventricle. And again, you see the nodulus here. All right. Now let's go to part A, or dorsal view again. And we see some very important structures deep inside the cerebellum. So deep inside the white matter of cerebellum are several nuclei that are organized from lateral to medial. So there is there are a pair of nuclei very close to midline, meaning that if you cut through the vermis, you would see those two nuclei on the sides. They're called fastigial nuclei. And if you move lateral, you see a very big nucleus. We call it dentate nucleus. In the middle of these two are two other nuclei. Collectively, we call them the interposed nuclei because they are between the two, but they are emboliform and glabus nucleus. And also there is a mnemonic: don't eat greasy food, which means dentate, emboliform, glabus, fastigial. This is for you to learn. But these are very important structures. In the horizontal cut or axial cut, you also see these nuclei in reality. So this is the dentate, and the one right in the midline is the fastigial. I will show you in the next slide how cerebellum, well, the cerebellum has a circuitry inside it, but I want to give you a general view. The cerebellum receives information from almost all over the body, the nervous system, and it processes the information on its cortex. So basically what we see, this cortex is where it receives information, processes information, and then it sends its processed information to these deep nuclei. And these are these deep nuclei that send the information out. So imagine cerebellum being a processor. It receives the information, processes the information on its cortex. Then it sends that information into these deep nuclei, and then these deep nuclei are the output of the cerebellum. That's why they are very important. Um, there is just one little kind of exception where the output of the cerebellum doesn't relay through these deep nuclei. And we will show that in a minute. And we will also tell you why is it exception. Some people would explain it as an exception, and some people would not explain it as an exception. Finally, the output of the cerebellum are through these deep nuclear structures inside the cerebellum. Now, let's take a look at basically the cortex. So let's see how when the information gets in, how it reaches the cortex and what happens there. This is a microcircuit architecture of the cerebellum. Again, we will study all these inputs. What does mossy fibers and climbing fibers mean? These are cerebellar inputs from different sources, and we will study them in detail. But I want you to know what happens in the cerebellum. So all the information, they finally reach the cortex of the cerebellum. They also, on their way up to the cortex, they send a copy to these deep cerebellar nuclei. The cortex processes the information and then send the processed information to these deep cerebellar nuclei that I showed you in the previous slide, and they send it out. They send it to the corresponding area. This is the exact or the actual microcircuitry. So if you take a look, you would see we have the mossy fibers and the climbing fibers. These are the inputs to the cerebellum. And I don't bother yourself right now with with the definitions and the names. These are just the inputs. But as you can see, they enter the cerebellum. The climbing fibers directly make contact with another cell, which is called Purkinje cell. These are very famous cells in the cerebellum. There is another type, which is called mossy fibers. They make synapse with granule cells in the cerebellum. And there is one thing very interesting about these granule cells. They rival the rest of the neurons in the central nervous system. So if we have 100% neurons in our nervous system, minimum of 50% of them are these granule cells in the cerebellum. That's how dense the cerebellum is. So it's it's very accurate to say that 50% of the neurons in the whole nervous system are located in the cerebellum because of these granule cells. All right, we do not focus and we do not emphasize on the details of information processing in the microarchitecture. That would be a separate session and would not really, I mean, it's nice to know, but more important is the input output of the cerebellum. That's why I do not explain this part in any more details. Just remember that when the sensory information gets in, it gets processed in the cerebellum, and then the cerebellum, the cortex, sends it back to its deep nuclei and then output. One other thing, again, just for your information, is that our cortex, cerebral cortex, the new cortex, as you may know, has 6 layers. Cerebellum has 3 layers. And again, this is the microarchitecture of the cerebellum. And again, just for your information, we are not going to the details. This is the action potentials generated by these neurons. And this action potential that you would see here is a very exceptional type of action potential that we do not have it anywhere else in the central nervous system. This action potential can only be seen in Purkinje cells, climbing fiber Purkinje cells of the cerebellum. But here is the story. We talked about the anatomy, but in fact, the anatomy does not correspond with function in cerebellum. What does that mean? It means if you look at cerebrum, our cortex, at our hemispheres, there is a damage to prefrontal cortex, you would see certain manifestations. But that's not the case in cerebellum. I mean, if you see, if there is hypothetical damage to the anterior lobe or to the posterior lobe, it would not cause a defined dysfunction. The cerebellum works very differently than its anatomical lobes. So even though we have to know the anatomy and the anatomical lobes of cerebellum, that's not the way actually it processes information. So the function and the anatomy of the lobes are very different. There are several reasons for that. So first of all is that when you see a pathology, the site of the pathology and the clinical manifestations of the pathology do not follow the anatomy or the anatomical lobes of the cerebellum. Second is actually the organization of the cerebellum that we will see in a minute. Cerebellum actually is made up of 3 different processing units, 3 to 4, but we can say 3 different processing units. And for that reason, we look at cerebellum, the functional lobes like that. There is one functional lobe which actually happens to correspond with the anatomy, and that is the flocculonodular lobe. And again, you see it here. This is the one that I highlighted in our previous slides. All right. Then you would see the vermis and the intermediate part of the cerebellum being another functional lobe, and then the lateral hemispheres. So these are functional lobes of the cerebellum. Also, if you look at cerebellum phylogenetically, you would see that flocculonodular is the oldest part of the cerebellum, and these lateral hemispheres are actually the newest parts. Even comparing human and ape with the monkey, you would see lateral hemispheres are more advanced in human and ape and less advanced in monkeys. And if you go down, you would see it's less and less advanced, but the oldest one that all species or vertebrates have is this flocculonodular lobe. And this is another way to look at the functional lobes of the cerebellum. And that is why we say it doesn't correspond with its function. All right. I will show you this image several times, and I have actually reorganized that in the next upcoming slides so you can better see that. But there are a few things. Cerebellum is at the center here, and it receives information and processes the information. So we have to take a look at the input. All right, let's see what type of input it receives. All right, even though you might not be able to read these texts because they are small size, you can see these illustrations. So cerebellum receives information from the eyes, from the vestibular system, from head and neck, proprioception of head and neck. It receives auditory stimulation, auditory signals. It receives somatic information of the trunk. Surprisingly, it receives all information of the cortex from almost the whole cortex, from the whole cerebrum. They send other information to the cerebellum and also sensory information of the limbs. I mean, if you take a moment and look at this, you will be surprised or even scared because this very small structure in our nervous system is receiving almost all information from the rest of the nervous system, from limbs to eyes. It receives a copy of all of these informations. This is a very critical monitoring center in our nervous system, and that's why cerebellum is absolutely essential for our survival. The only information that you don't see here is basically olfactory information. That is the only sensation that cerebellum does not at least directly process. Does it indirectly do that? There are evidence to show that because, finally, olfactory goes to a portion, a part in the cortex, and that cortex is connected, sends information. But how important olfactory information is, probably not that important, but the rest are very important. You would see that if there is a damage to cerebellum, your patient might have problem with their eyes or movement of the eyes. All right, now this is one thing I wanted you to look at. The second thing, look, we have these different sensory informations, and you would see the right side is very different from what you see here on the left side. This is cortex. These are eyes, vestibular system, and trunk and head and neck proprioceptive information. As you can see, this sensory information, as you can see, and you might correctly guess, they go to the flocculonodular lobe. Okay? Sensory information of trunk, again, eyes, of auditory and vestibular, go to vermis and the intermediate zone, and sense and all the information of the cortices and the limbs go to the lateral and intermediate respectively with some overlaps, as you can see. All right, so now you can appreciate that there is a functional organization here. You can say folliculonodular is a separate processor. The lateral hemispheres, they are a separate processor. Vermis and the intermediate is also another separate processor. And remember, we have right side and left side cerebellum, correct? So the vermis, we have right vermis, left vermis, right intermediate, left intermediate, right folliculonodular, left folliculonodular. Okay? And then you would see that they send information back to certain areas. Again, there are some overlaps, but you can see that segregation. So this folliculonodular receives the information from these areas and send it to vestibular nuclei. Again, if you have studied IFS, we talked about medial and lateral vestibulospinal tract. Actually, cerebellum is affecting the medial motor system and through its folliculonodular, lateral motor system through the cortices and intermediate zone, and again, medial motor system through vermis. I think I jumped the gun. Don't be scared. We will go over these. Okay, so let's quickly review what we learned so far because we want to make sure that we follow the path and we follow the roadmap. So we learned anatomy of cerebellum, and we learned that it has three functional lobes, which are different from its anatomical lobes. We took a very quick look at its basic inside architecture or circuitry, and also we learned that there are some deep nuclei that receive the processed information, send them out. So the cortex receives the information through this circuitry, they process the information, then they send it to these deep nuclei, and the deep nuclei send it out. Now, the same image, I actually reorganized that, and I hope you can see it a little bit better right now. So what I did, I put input here, cerebellum, and then the output here. This is the same image, and this would be our roadmap to understand and to review things. And I just rearranged them, hoping that you can see the text. All right. So remember, cerebellum actually is made up of three different processing units. And again, disclaimer, there are some overlaps in some parts, but basically there are three separate units. We will start from the first one, the folliculonodular. To do that, actually, I remove the rest of the cerebellum to make things a little bit clearer. And let's take a look at the folliculonodular lobe. That is what you see. So this folliculonodulus, sometimes it is called vestibulocerebellum, another name for folliculonodulus. It receives basically vestibular information, so information about our balance. So we have this vestibular system that tells us our orientation, our linear and angular acceleration. It sends its information to the cerebellum. All right. Also, our eyes, when we move our eyes, they send information to the folliculonodular. And also when we move our head and neck, we send the information, the proprioceptive information to the folliculonodular. So as you can see, you can kind of tell that it is dealing with our balance our orientation, and more importantly, the orientation of head and neck and eye movement. So far, so good. This means that if there is a damage to flocculonodular lobe, that can actually happen. This frequently happens in clinics, in clinical representation, and I'll tell you why in a minute. You might see that your patient has weird nystagmus, depending on which side of folliculonodular has been affected. Nystagmus to one side would not be smooth, so they do not have a smooth eye pursuit in one direction, or they might have balance issues. Why is it clinically relevant? Because this folliculonodular is located anatomically very close to actually cranial nerve number 8, and cranial number 8 is very prone to acoustic neuroma, a benign tumor that actually grows in that and puts pressure actually on folliculonodular. And when a neurologist see those symptoms, that they don't have correct eye pursuit, they have balance issues, things like that, they might wonder and they might suspect that there might be an acoustic neuroma putting pressure on folliculonodular. All right, so again, it receives information and it sends the information. Question for you, did it send the information out through the output nuclei of the cerebellum? You don't see that here, correct? That is the only exception. And this is the oldest part of the cerebellum. It's an exception, or some people say, no, it's not an exception. There is a reason for that. It sends the information to vestibular nuclei in our pons. And some neuroanatomists, they consider these vestibular nuclei as a part of deep nuclei of the cerebellum. If you look at it from this perspective, again, it's not an exception. It sends the information to the output nuclei of the cerebellum. And let's get back to one of our previous slides, and you would see that this is Bloomfield, and Bloomfield actually regards vestibular nuclei as a part of deep cerebellar nuclei. All right, so it doesn't tell you that this is an exception, but there are some other neuroscientists who would say this is an exception, and the reason is that they do not consider vestibular nuclei as a part of orthodox, old-style deep cerebellar nuclei. All right, so it depends how you interpret that, but finally they send to other nuclei, and then these are the nuclei that exert the effect on other parts of the nervous system. Okay, so again, input, processed, output. Now we want to look at other processing units of cerebellum. I wanted to actually delete the rest, but I did that and it didn't make sense. So actually I kept it, but I can actually do this. So use a pen. And now we want to look at the intermediate, at the vermis and intermediate. Okay, so again, I have tilted the image. What you see here is the vermis. Everybody agrees with me? All right, and everybody agrees that the fastigial nucleus is right here in the vermis. Okay, so we receive certain sensory information. You can see from trunk, somatosensory, auditory information, and again, visual information. Again, so this is the input. They go to the vermis. The cortex of the vermis process this information, as you can see with these arrows. It sends it to fastigial, and then the fastigial sends it out. It sends to vestibular nuclei again, and also to red nucleus and reticular nuclei that we will see in a minute. So again, we are putting different pieces together. We need to go back and forth, all right? But again, what I want you to understand and actually answer before I answer that question is, if you want to make an educated guess, what would be the role of this vermis, or which part of our motor system will it affect? And the answer is right here. So again, vermis is involved in balance. Remember, whenever we talk about vestibular nuclei, we are talking about balance, all right? Because these are the vestibular nuclei that send down the lateral vestibulospinal tract, medial and lateral vestibulospinal tract that you have learned. They actually have a big role in control of posture. Okay, now let's take a look at the intermediate area. Again, there is an input and there is an output. The input is from proprioceptive of the limbs, not only upper extremity, but also lower extremity, from primary motor and sensory cortex. They send the information in. And again, if you want to make an educated guess, the cortex of the intermediate zone or intermediate lobe processes that, and then it sends it to which output nuclei. And you see actually right here, interposed. All right. So if you put all of this together, you see that anatomically now it makes sense that we say we have these three functional lobes, because vermis, fastigial is right there. So vermis processes the information, sends it to the deep nuclei, which is right there, the fastigial. Intermediate processes the information, mainly sends it to the IP. This is the nucleus, which is right there. So receiving the input from this part of the cortex. And therefore, when we look at the lateral part, which we said phylogenetically is the newest one, uh, it receives from association cortex. It processes the information and then sends it to dentate, and then dentate sends it back actually to our motor cortex, premotor cortex, and parietal cortices. So far, so good. All right, so as you can see, cerebellum does a lot of things. So it does a lot of processing. It does a lot of processing and is a very important center. This is what I want you to keep in mind, and we will have this image several times because we go back and forth to learn different parts of that. Um, so I clean this one and let's move on. So right now, so far, we talked about input and output, but now we have another question to answer in the next 20 minutes, is that what are the actual anatomical pathways from these parts or these sensory receptors to the cerebellum? Right now, here we have just shown that with an arrow. We draw an arrow, but where is it anatomically? Where is that? If we look at these arrows in real world situation with their anatomy, so how, for example, cortex is connected to the cerebellum and how it sends the information, basically we are looking at the input pathways of cerebellum. And the same thing applies here. So when the dentate, for example, receives the processed information and sends it out, where is anatomically, where is this arrow in reality? Okay. And clinically, it is important because in stroke, sometimes actually the pathways are being affected, correct? Let me make an example for you. um, you have two patients. One patient has a cerebellar stroke. The cerebellum has been damaged, all right? They have ataxia. You have another patient, you have the MRI, the patient has almost the same type of ataxia, but you look at their MRI and you see cerebellum is not the site of injury. Cerebellum is intact. But what you see, and neurologists actually can detect it even with their neurological examination, is that one of these pathways was affected. So the cerebellum doesn't receive the information to process. It's the same thing. If the cerebellum doesn't receive the information, there is no output. If the cerebellum receives the information but is damaged and cannot process, again, the same thing. Clinically, there are certain differences, but the idea is the same thing, ataxia, as an example. The other thing is that now if you look at an MRI of a patient with cerebellar damage and you see the vermis has been affected, you can guess that it should be the patient might be able to have sound arm movement, but not a good posture, not a good balance. But the upper extremity might be okay. Why? Because that is not in the vermis. Correct? This is trunk. All right. Or if you see they have what we call appendicular ataxia, means ataxia of the extremities, most probably, if they don't have any other issues, most probably it is not the vermis. It should be the intermediate or lateral hemispheres, all right? And again, this would tell us functional lobes are different than anatomical lobes, as we can see here. All right, so let me show you how the cortex sends information to the cerebellum. Take a deep breath. Ready? Go. All right. So you should be familiar with corticospinal tract. We have a tract that is very close to corticospinal tract, originates from the same location, but actually it goes to the pons. And for that reason, we call it corticopontine tract. Starts from cortex, ends in the pons, but follows the same path as the corticospinal tract. All right, meaning that it passes through the internal capsule. Okay, I want you to track it here, and actually I can show you. So if this is corticospinal, this one would be corticopontine. As you can see, it is going down, 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 down. It reaches the pons and makes a synapse with a neuron or a nucleus in the pons. All right. And can I clear that? All right, I think that would be easier. Yeah. You would see it makes a synapse with a neuron and then crosses over, goes to the contralateral pons. Do you see that? That crossover. This one is a little bit busy. We have another illustration right here. This is a nice illustration of the corticospinal tract and corticopontine. As you can see, it starts, it ends in the pons, makes a synapse with the nuclei in the pons, and then goes to the contralateral pons, contralateral cerebellum. The corticospinal tract goes further down and again crosses over, goes to the contralateral side of the spinal cord, and that is in the pyramidal decussation. Okay, so finally, both of these pathways go to the contralateral side. The corticopontine, this is the part that sends all the information of the cortices to the pons and relays in the pons and then crosses over. For that reason, this part is called pontocerebellar pathway. Again, don't worry about names. They are very intuitive, but this is how the cortex sends the information in. So they finally reach the cortex of the cerebellum, and the cerebellum processes, sends it back to its deep nuclei, and again sends it back, that we will see it as an output. All right. Now, so this is input from the cortex. We also told you that it receives lots of input from spinal cord, correct? Okay. Actually, from spinal cord, it receives two different types of information. It receives a copy of proprioceptive information from the spinal cord, meaning that when you move your limbs, proprioceptive information enter the spinal cord. You have studied the pathways, dorsal column, medial lemniscus, to go to the primary sensory cortex, correct? A copy of that also goes to the cerebellum. All right, so that is how our cerebellum, through extensive calculations, can determine our joint angles based on the proprioceptive information. All right, the way it reaches are through two pathways that I will show you actually those pathways briefly: a dorsal pathway and a coniocerebellar pathway that I will show you in a minute. On top of that, so this is one type of information that spinal cord sends to the cerebellum, but there is one other thing which is again amazing, and that is information from spinal interneurons that the cerebellum also monitor and receives. Why? So when we send motor plan into our spinal cord, the cerebellum needs to receive a copy of that. And it receives the information through the activity, monitoring the activity of spinal interneurons. It also receives proprioceptive information. So look what happens. You can say this is the intended plan by the nervous system. This is what happened in reality. Cerebellum receives both and compares the two and can detect the error. All right? That's why it receives actually a lot of information from spinal cord. A copy of proprioception, a copy of the activity of interneurons. And again, there are two pathways that send that. I care more about the concept of proprioception of the limbs and activity of the interneurons rather than focusing on these two pathways. I'm going to show you the pathways in a minute, but again, you take a look at them. The main idea is for you to understand what type of information are getting there. All right, let's do it very quickly. Again, you should be familiar with dorsal column, medial lemniscus. And you know the principle that sensory information enters spinal cord through the dorsal column. And again, I'm going to use the pointer, laser pointer. So through the dorsal column, it goes up. But as you can see, the cerebellum actually snatches a copy, receives a copy through a separate pathway that we call it nucleus of Clark. Again, it's good to know. If you think it is confusing, forget about that. The thing is that the cerebellum receives a copy. Do we have a question? Okay, all right. So not a bad idea. I take a look at all right, the chat. Okay, all right. Okay, so you would see that again, sensory information goes to the cerebellum. This is what we call the dorsal spinocerebellar tract, and it is very straightforward. Does it go to the same side of cerebellum or the contralateral side? It's the same side. Let's say this is right side. Sensory information of right goes to the right cerebellum. All right. Okay. This is for lower extremity. For upper extremity is the coniocerebellar. So basically, let's go back to our previous slide, if we could. Basically, dorsal and coniocerebellar means lower extremity, upper extremity. That's it. But they are conveying proprioceptive information. All right. Now we want to see how the information of the interneurons reach cerebellum. All right. That one can be seen here. So where I have located my pointer. All right. You see my pointer right here. All right. There are some neurons here in the spinal cord. They are called border cell neurons. All right. They are interneurons. They send information through a pathway that you would see it here. We call it ventral spinocerebellar, and that's because of simply because of its anatomical location. But look what happened. Actually, they cross to the contralateral side in the spinal cord. Do you see that? All right. They cross the spinal cord, they go up, but when they want to reach cerebellum, they cross over one more time. So they go back to the same side of the cerebellum. Here is the principle. Right cerebellum deals with the right side, left cerebellum deals with the left side. This means that damage to right cerebellum would affect the right side. Damage to left cerebellum would affect left side. This is not the case about cortex. Right cortex affects left side and vice versa. A right cortical stroke causes left side paralysis. A right side cerebellar stroke affects right side of the body. Okay? So as you can see, even if a sensory information crosses over, it will cross over back to the cerebellum. So the cerebellum receives sensory information of the same side because it is governing and monitoring ipsilateral side of the body. And this is something you need to like wrap your head around it. For that reason, because cerebellum is governing ipsilaterally, it should receive information of the contralateral cortex. And it makes a lot of sense. This seems to be confusing, but it is very easy to understand. The contralateral hemisphere or cerebral cortex governs the contralateral side of the body. So left cortex is controlling the right side of the body. Right cerebellum is controlling and monitoring the right side of the body. Put them together. This means that right cerebellum needs to receive information of the left cortex because that is the cortex that is governing the right side. And that is why you would see the cortex, the corticopontine needs to cross over and goes to the contralateral because if this is the right side is controlling the left side of the body. Therefore, the left cerebellum needs to receive information. Left cerebellum is monitoring left side of the body. All right, again, I tilted the image. You might get a better resolution about the pathway. So this is that dorsal spinocerebellar pathway. This is coniocerebellar pathway. And as you can see, same side goes to ipsilateral cerebellum. Then the part that is from interneurons, it crosses over one time, goes to the contralateral side, moves up, but when it wants to go back again, crosses over one more time to make sure that it goes back to ipsilateral cerebellum. Cerebellum is controlling the right side, needs to receive information of the right side. So far, so good? All right. So again, to make sure that we understand what we are talking about, we talked about this pathway, all right, or these two pathways basically, from the cortex and from spinal cord reaches cerebellum. All right, so we went to the details of that, but that is still our roadmap. It receives information, processes, sends the information back. Now let's take a look at these pathways. Um, and I know the information might be a little bit dense. You might need time, like to sleep on it, think about it. But I'm sure with a little bit of study, it would click if you follow this sequence that are presented in the material. All right, this is the output of the cerebellum. Um, um, just a couple of examples. This is dentate nucleus. And we said dentate nucleus is the output, and it sends the information back into the cortex. Again, as you can see, this is the right, let's say this is the right cerebellum. It is sending the information back to the left motor cortex because the left motor cortex is controlling the right side of the body. So right cerebellum receives information from the right side, communicate with the left cortex because the left cortex is controlling the right side of the body. All right. And again, the way it sends the information is that it sends it to the thalamus or the VL of thalamus, contralateral thalamus, and then it sends it to the motor cortex. Okay. Um, we have one motor generating area called the red nucleus. As you can see, it sends to the contralateral red nucleus because red nucleus also sends the information to the contralateral side of the body. I skipped the definition of this long feedback loop. This is something interesting you can study on your own. That is, as you can see, there is a long loop here. Sends out, goes to inferior olive, and goes back to the cerebellum. We are not discussing this one. If it catches your eye, this is a long loop in cerebellum. Another example is so this is actually it shows you it goes to the contralateral cortex. The contralateral cortex again decussates and goes back. This is the rubrospinal that I told you. It goes to the contralateral one and again goes crosses over. So you see actually you have double crossing. It crosses to the left, comes back to the right. And that's why right side monitors and influences the right side. Left cerebellum manages and monitors and influence the left side. All right. The same for vestibular nuclei. If you remember, we told you that it is the fastigial nucleus that sends information to the vestibular and folliculonodular. We don't see it here. And you see it sends actually to both sides. So there is a bilateral connection. All right, so again, these are the output pathways. Again, remember that we have different regions of body from cortex, from the eyes, from auditory system, vestibular system, you name it. They send the information to the cerebellum. Cerebellum processes, sends it out. The only thing is that cerebellum always monitors its same side, the ipsilateral. This means that it needs to receive sensory information of ipsilateral side and information of the cortex of the contralateral side because left cortex monitors right side of the body and right cerebellum is monitoring right side. So it finally needs to receive information corresponding to the same side of the body. So let's review and see what we did. First of all, the amazing thing is that this very small area, which is about 10% of our nervous system, receives huge information from various places in our nervous system. This is a monitoring system. So it acts as an error predictor. We could talk actually about experiments and other parts and functions of cerebellum, but it has a huge role in learning motor tasks. Cerebellum also has some role in cognitive processing. there are strong evidence to show that dysfunction of cerebellum plays role in schizophrenia or in autism spectrum disorder. So the main domain of cerebellum is motor, but it also has some non-motor functions. All right. It receives proprioceptive information from the spinal cord and activity of the interneurons of the spinal cord. And the hypothesis or the idea is that comparing these two would give the cerebellum the idea of what the nervous system planned, what happened in reality. Remember, cerebellum exerts its influence on the ipsilateral side. And you might hear that, the double crossing phenomenon. And now we answer that question, why active movement? So remember, cerebellum is monitoring what the central nervous system designed and executed. Passive proprioceptive information reaches our conscious sensation. So our cortex would be aware of that. And that's why if you passively move the joint of a cerebellar patient, they can tell because that type of proprioception reaches their conscious level. But when it comes to movement that the cerebellum needs to monitor, for example, through the activity of those interneurons, this is unconscious proprioception, or the proprioceptive copy that they receive from um, dorsal and coniocerebellar pathways. They are unconscious proprioception, and that is the part that cerebellum detects and monitors and corrects movement. For that reason, cerebellum has a very important role in monitoring and in correcting our motor system. It's a feed-forward system. It constantly predicts what will happen and exert and influence our motor systems, both lateral and medial motor system, so you will have a smooth movement. The fact that we can compensate for changes in the torque and external torque, and when we want to target, we can precisely correct our cells. All of these are because of our cerebellum. Okay, I wanted to finish it actually in 1 hour. We are a little bit over. Um, Again, first and foremost, thank you all of you to attend this session. I hope you learn, and thanks to Dr. Fradinger for setting up this meeting for us. Now, if you have questions or if there is any of the slides you want me to explain more, now it's your time.
Thank you, Dr. Tahayori.
Sure. All right. Okay. So again, next out, I can go back to this slide. I hope you learn. I know cerebellum is not an easy part of our nervous system. And I hope this session gave you like the general view of function of the cerebellum, inputs to the cerebellum, and output of the cerebellum. All right, with that said, thank you so much for attending the meeting, and all of you have a wonderful evening. Bye. All right, I'll wait a few minutes if there is any last minute question, but thank you for attending and have a good evening.
Hi.
Hi.
Where can we find the recording of the lesson?
You want the recording?
Yeah.
All right, so if you go to iLife website, you would see the recordings over there. And Dr. Freilinger will also upload the recording of this. So all of them should be in the iLife.
Great. Thank you so much.
Sure. Okay. Everybody, have a good evening. Bye.